The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on the agenda.
I'm not saying that grade inflation doesn't exist, but I think that's just one of the explanations for why a student might come out with a higher grade than anticipated.
Then, later tonight.
When you're a young kid dealing with institutional racism yourself, to have people like the AllStars there as your role models, it's really important.
As any grade 12 student applying to college or university knows, grades matter. And judging by rising graduating averages, Ontario students are getting smarter by the day. An alternative theory, though, is that those higher grades are attributable to something other than clever high schoolers. With us now to explore what's going on in Sudbury, Ontario, Serge Demers, Associate Vice President, Students, Registrar, and Secretary of Senate at Laurentian University. In Etobicoke, Ontario, Paul Grayson, Professor of Sociology at York University. And here in our studio, Aisha Mahmood, President of the Ontario Student Trustees Association and a grade 12 student in Hamilton, and Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, Associate Professor and Program Coordinator at Wilfrid Laurier University's Law and Society program. Welcome all. And just before we get started, in the interest of transparency, let's remind everyone that TVO offers online secondary school courses through the Independent Learning Centre and is the Ontario government's partner in digital learning. So with that, welcome in studio, welcome on the line. Now, I want a little table setter, so let's look at a chart which shows the averages of grade 12 students between 2007 and 2022. This data was gathered by the Toronto Star and provided by 6 school boards across the Greater Toronto Area. For audience members listening in, the lines on the chart show an increase in grade averages at the Dufferin-Peel Catholic School Board, York Region District School Board, Toronto District School Board, Toronto Catholic District School Board, and Durham Catholic District School Board. The only school board where a steady increase doesn't seem to be in the case is the Durham District School Board, which you can see in the orange at the bottom. And I will mention that 4 boards did not provide their data to the Star in this study. All right, with that being said, let's start off. Paul, I want you to get us started. In a sentence or two, are Ontario high schools inflating grades?
Well, they are, but I think you have to go back way further than the information that you provided, because the system really changed, believe it or not, in the late 60s, that long ago. What happened was, prior to that date, we had in Ontario and like the other provinces, something akin to the A levels in Britain, where kids write basically the same examination in a particular topic, and that exam is graded by people who don't know the student. They're centrally graded. There was a lot wrong with that system, but what happened was when that was basically curtailed, the number of Ontario scholars shot up. In other words, there was grade inflation because there was no control over the assessment process. And the big problem from then and going on to now is that individual teachers make assessments. And certainly they're working with the same curriculum, but there is no basic way of ensuring that what teacher A sees as an A is what teacher B would see as an A. And there are a number of other factors that contribute to the inflation, but I don't want to hog things here, so I'll just say that I don't think this is a recent problem. It's one that has increased over the years. I also want to make it very, very clear that our good students are as good as they've ever been. In fact, they're as good as students anywhere. The real problem is the average student, and the quality, I shouldn't say the quality of the student, the knowledge and motivation brought to studies by the average student has very drastically declined.
All right, Kelly, I'm going to come to you. Same question.
Well, I think there's no doubt that grades have gone up, and there's always going to be a concern about to what extent those grades reflect underlying skills and knowledge. I would say there are reasons to believe that if you look at that longer line, there are reasons that grades really might have gone up, reflecting an increase in skills and knowledge. For example, we've had more immigration from high-achieving groups. We've lost students have left the applied program, which we know depressed achievement in large numbers. And we've had really significant efforts to try and support marginalized students, like the TDSB's Center for Black Excellence, that have actually, maybe worked. Radical idea.
Serge.
I think, much like Paul, I believe that some of the inflation is due to policy more so than the actual teacher in the classroom being more generous. So I think the provincial government over the past few years has provided some guidance to teachers in terms of how they evaluate, why they evaluate, and I think we're now seeing basically a result of that in terms of, as Kelly indicated, some groups like students with learning disabilities, there's been a strong move to try to level the playing field with them. So all of those things put together, I believe, have had an impact. The spike that we see, I think, is more COVID related, and we'll have to see where things land post that COVID spike.
All right, Aisha.
Yeah, so there are a lot of factors, I think, that are going into the higher averages that we're seeing at school boards across the GTA and across Ontario as a whole. Like Kelly was mentioning, there are students who are now receiving supports that they didn't have access to before, which is helping them achieve grades that they wouldn't have been able to achieve before. But there's also this additional pressure on students from their parents, from teachers, from administrators, from their peers to be achieving at a really high level to open up as many pathways as possible into their future. I'm in grade 12 right now. A lot of the experience of my peers this year has been, will my average be high enough to get into this university program, or will I meet this cutoff? And it's hard to kind of use grades, which I think we can all agree are a subjective number that we place onto a student's learning to determine what their future might look like at 17, 18 years old. So I think that there's a slight discrepancy between the fact that students have missed out on a lot of key learning over the past few years, and not just learning content-wise, but also the development of skills they need to be successful, and also that additional pressure on schools and students to be, for students to achieve these high averages so that they can access these opportunities. So it's hard to say. I think in my perspective, I only really have kind of a short-term look over the past few years, but there's a lot of factors at play. I don't think that high-achieving students are any less high-achieving than they were, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, but at the same time, I think these higher grades are more commonplace just because of all of these factors that are now a part of that final average.
Okay. Kelly, we reached out to 3 different public teachers' unions in hopes a representative could participate. They were unavailable, and 2 of the organizations were unavailable to produce a written statement in time for the show, citing the complexity of this issue. I'm just curious, why is this such a sensitive issue for teachers?
Well, I think one of the things we should point to, first of all, I also want to say the jump in grades during COVID probably looks to me like job and grade inflation, because we know, if you look at international evidence, by and large, achievement went down, right? In terms of tests.
Right.
So the COVID spike is something special, and I think we need to pay a lot of attention to it and make sure that post-secondary institutions are catching. But your question is, why is this complicated? Well, grades do a lot of things in our society, right? They communicate to the student. They're a kind of quick and dirty form of feedback about how you're doing relative to expectations and perhaps relative to other people in your classroom. They communicate to families, and I think that's a really important form, especially when report cards are written in gobbledygook. You know what a B means, right? They communicate, and especially if you're struggling with language or have some of the other challenges, that's a really important job. They also are used to sort students, and in a kind of winner-takes-all social system where it seems like there's certain programs that are brighter and shinier than everything else, it's easy to get really focused on the sort of needs of the top 5-10% of students. it's really important that we notice that actually alongside grades going up, graduation's gone up and post-secondary access has gone up considerably in Ontario. So out of the Toronto District School Board, I did a research project with the TDSB and a Higher Education Quality Council. We saw the majority of TDSB students go to university for the first time during COVID. And we saw groups that have historically been a little more marginalized. So yeah, there's still competition and I think a heck of a lot of stress at the top. But one of the things that's not happening is that kids aren't getting into university. More kids are going to university than ever before, and college is holding steady.
All right, I want to stick with you because I want to ask, in terms of even the data that was showed was mostly in the GTA, and I want to kind of get an idea of how prevalent or consistent is grade inflation across the province. Do we have an idea that this is happening in all school boards in every corner of this province?
We don't really. There's real problems getting province-wide data in Ontario, and the ministry is really slow and hesitates with transparency. It's a real challenge. The last thing I want to say about grades, final thing, standardized tests give us some information about students relative to others, and there's always a will to compare, and that's not that surprising. Grades represent the teacher's professional judgment about how a student's doing, taking into account context, motivation, challenge, and progress over the course of a year. And if we look at the long-term evidence, grades are far more predictive of students' outcomes than standardized test scores.
All right. Aisha.
Can I jump in?
Yes, yeah,
for
Paul.
something here?
Yep.
In Alberta, they have a dual system whereby students in grade 12 are graded by their teachers, but they also write provincial examinations that are arm's length. And there's as much as a 20% difference in particular subjects between the grading of teachers and the grading that is done externally. The average difference is 8%. That's the difference between a B and an A. So this, I think, is very substantial information that there is a problem with teachers. I'm not blaming the teachers. They're in a pressure cooker. But it's a systems problem, and it has to be dealt with at the level of a system. The other thing is, University of Waterloo collects information on the grades, I believe, of incoming engineering students, and they correlate that with the grades that students received in grade 12. And there's an incredible discrepancy on a school-by-school basis, absolutely incredible. And that gap is increasing, which leads to the obvious conclusion that you can't rely on teachers' evaluations because they vary so much. Here you have the same curriculum and you have varying grades coming out of that system, and they don't necessarily mean anything in terms of university performance. I completed a 4-university study recently, and students say they don't have the skills required for success, even though those skills are part of the post-secondary curriculum.
All right. Aisha, I want to get you in, and then I want to get Surgeon. From a student perspective, you talked a little bit about that. Paint the picture a little bit about what the difference is between grade inflation and, say, a teacher rewarding a student who's taken the initiative, to ask for opportunities to improve their grades, say with, bonus work or something. Is there a difference between that and, say, grade inflation?
Yeah, so I think this difference happens, and the way that I've seen it kind of pan out in real life is the difference between a student, for example, who consistently scores high on their tests, grades well on their assignments throughout the year, and a student who comes into the course, maybe struggles at first, receives some lower test scores, but then has shown more significant growth throughout the course. Those two students, if you were to put those numbers into a formula that weighs all their grades and comes out with an average, that second student might actually come out with a lower grade. But I think the teacher uses that professional judgment to show, do I want to show that growth and learning or just performance on a test. So I think that there is something to be said about teachers kind of using that professional judgment and the observations they've made. How do students interact with their peers? Are they supporting the learning of their peers? Are they engaging in classroom activities? Are they taking initiative to come and get help at lunch? Or are they just performing well on tests? And I think both of those kinds of merit, both of those observations have merit to them and should account into a student's final grade. So I think it's hard to distinguish between when a grade may be inflated, because on the surface it may seem that, oh, but this student scored this, this, and this on their test throughout the course. But if you look a little deeper, that might actually be the case. I'm not saying that grade inflation doesn't exist, but I think that's just one of the explanations for why a student might come out with a higher grade than anticipated in the final course. Of course, there are situations where there's pressure from parents, families, for a teacher to deliver a higher final mark, and that's certainly been the case. But there's a lot going on there.
All right, Serge, that top 6 that high school students are trying to, get to a pristine level that they feel confident that they'll get into their programs. How much of that is sort of in response to some universities becoming more competitive and requiring higher marks?
Yeah, I think you're quite right. The pressure over the past few years for grade 12 grades has expanded considerably. So data that we have for students who are applying to any university in Ontario would show that the percentage of students with an 80 or above has grown by at least 10 percentage points over the past 3 years. So whereas once upon a time, maybe 3 out of 4 students had an 80 or above, now we're looking at closer to 4 out of 5 students having that grade. So it is becoming far more competitive on the intake side for students, and the reaction or the reflex for students is therefore to try to get as high grades as possible. And the teachers in grade 12 are also realizing that and perhaps trying to help the students out. The downside of that is that once they end up in the university program, then their expectation of maintaining those grades usually come crashing down.
Does Laurentian and other universities take grade inflation into account when accepting or denying students? I know we had an example from Paul about Waterloo, which we will get to. But does your university take grade inflation into account?
So our institution is basically an access institution, an access university. So we consider any student having the entry requirement, which for us is mostly 70%. We consider those at par value. So we do not adjust in much as the example for Waterloo has been given.
All right, Paul. We talked about sort of how much the education system has changed and sort of looking at grade inflation. I want to, just in the last 2 decades, so much has changed. Kelly has talked about sort of de-streaming. We have sort of credit recovery opportunities. We have the 5th year as well to help. Could these changes account for sort of those higher grade averages as well?
They could, but it gets down to what do these grade averages mean? And if you look at StatsCan data, and if you look at the business press, the StatsCan data show that there's been no improvement in the skills and knowledge of people graduating from universities. And the business press is always lamenting the lack of basic skills on the part of graduates. So while they're getting higher and higher grades, that isn't manifest in the studies done by Stats Canada, nor is it manifest in terms of their job performance. I mean, one of the most difficult and most distressing findings is the low level of literacy among university graduates. And that is something that is universally regarded as a problem. So, when you ask that question, I'm thinking, okay, but what does all this mean in terms of outcomes and performance in the real world? Is it a system that basically has its own metrics, and those metrics don't bear any relationship to what goes on elsewhere, and I'm forced to conclude the latter.
I want to stick with you in terms. You talk about literacy rates. Are there any other risks when we look at grade inflation that may that is posed to our educational system?
Well, there's also an effect on the good students that I mentioned at the beginning. I mean, you have seminar situations where you have one or two people who are excellent, and unfortunately the rest are not up to their level. They don't have the same skills, and they basically sit there. And that becomes a very unrewarding situation for the good students. And in some instances, there's sort of a withdrawal. Well, why am I bothering? And that I think is very problematic.
All right, Aisha, do some students suffer as a result of grade inflation?
Oh, this is a tough question. I think that students over the past couple of years, if that's kind of where we're seeing this increase, have struggled to develop some of the key skills they need to achieve high grades, while also seeing higher than average grades amongst their peers, and even if they are themselves experiencing that grade inflation. So I think that in a lot of ways it's created a sort of competitive culture around grades and what that really means, and also the way that students value their learning. So I think because we're seeing grades as almost like this currency of how do I get the highest grade possible, rather than how do I learn the most or how do I benefit the most out of the courses that I'm taking, has honestly been detrimental to the way students think about and experience school and even interact with their peers. I think it's no surprise that students and youth in Ontario are experiencing a mental health crisis, and I wouldn't be surprised to see if this culture around achievement in school is also adding to those levels of anxiety or stress amongst youth. So in a lot of ways, it may be a short-term benefit where that extra couple percent in your average helps you meet the cutoff for the program that you need. But I think in the long term, it creates a very bad mindset around grades, and then for students going into post-secondary, that mindset doesn't end in grade 12. It continues, and it can be really detrimental to someone's self-worth if they have constantly associated that with grades. Yep. And they are not achieving those same grades in university, or they're struggling, or they don't even have the skills to be high achieving, then it, like Serge was mentioning, it kind of all comes crashing down. Right.
Very interesting points. Kelly, benefits to grade inflation. What are there? Because there's some very interesting studies that look into the grade inflation may play into STEM and the role of women in classes and stuff like that. But I want to talk to you about what benefits, if there are any, to grade inflation that you see.
Yeah, I'm not sold that there are benefits to grade inflation. I think it's understandable if you look at the kind of currently I think undeniable issues around grades in the last 2 or 3 years, that I think teachers had a lot fewer tools in their toolkit to keep students who are learning remotely at a distance engaged and motivated and supported and believing in their own success. And I think sometimes grades were used as part of that kind of package of motivation. I totally agree with everything Aisha just said. She said it beautifully. I think there really are some risks at the high end, but we have seen an increase in access to post-secondary, and progression is something somewhat separate from learning. I think what it does is put a real challenge on universities and colleges, that we need to know that students are going to continue to need support with skills development. We as universities can't blame high schools if students come out of university with not subpar skills. It's our job. We've got them. We want to make sure they're learning. So I don't really personally think there are a lot of advantages to grade inflation. I think there are lots of checks in the system. Students do write comparable tests in grade 9 and 10, for example. We know that the schools that are the furthest out of whack with the Waterloo measures are mostly private schools. So the public system has some constraints going on that we don't necessarily see in the private school system, and I think there's reasons to be concerned about that. But I would say that, when we look at how students have progressed over the last 40 years, I graduated from high school in 1988. 60% of kids were graduating from high school right now. Now it's 87%. Right. The world is requiring more knowledgeable and skilled people. And it's a good thing that we're seeing people continuing to be engaged, setting themselves hopefully on the paths of lifelong learning, not transactional grade work. But I think there's some real strengths and triumphs for the education system. Then there's a lot to be proud of.
All right. Serge, I want to ask you about University of Waterloo. Paul and Kelly both mentioned it. Obviously, they have a grade adjustment system where applicants, in which their marks are adjusted or deducted based on what high schools they come out of. Are internal tools like that would you consider a fair response to grade inflation, or are there other measures? I know, particularly with the University of Waterloo, that is not their only thing that they look at. They also look at an in-person interview. They have essays and a portfolio as well. But should that be part of the toolkit?
Yeah, so I mean, in order for an institution to do that with any kind of good results, they need a whole lot of experience with each of those schools, right? So if one student comes from a Northern Ontario school, went to Waterloo and failed miserably, hopefully that doesn't then taint the story for the next student coming in the next year. So it's a double-edged sword when you're using very small sample sizes to come up with that tool. So I've not seen the tool. I don't know exactly how they use it, but my hope would be that they have enough information to make more reasoned decisions than simply using very straightforward, simple math. But Waterloo's a great institution. I'm a graduate from there, and I know that the math that they use is usually world class. So I would expect that that's the case as well. I think for some of the other pieces that you're mentioning, so a lot of US schools are going to standardized tests for admissions, the SATs of the world and whatnot. That is in fact to try to help the institutions out in finding who are the top students from an objective point of view, and whether or not that will become something in Canada for either all institutions, some institutions, or some programs, I guess remains to be seen. But that may indeed be the response of post-secondary institutions if the grade inflation goes too far. I think Paul mentioned Alberta. I was also a teacher, a high school teacher in Alberta, and at the time 50% of the grade came from that ministry exam. Now it's down to 20%, but it still does give institutions, or it levels, in my view, the playing field with all the advantages and disadvantages of those types of tests.
Kelly, did you want to get in on that? Or
I just wanted to jump in. I think the conversation around standardized testing as a response to grade inflation, or kind of trying to find an objective way to measure the achievement of students, I personally take a lot of issue with standardized testing. I've heard consistently from students, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support that standardized tests measure your ability to take that test rather than your ability to achieve in that particular subject area. I think I saw some research the other day that said that the SATs were a more consistent indicator of household income than the achievement of students. So I think it's hard to say whether standardized tests, which in a lot of parts of the world have kind of faded out over time, and I think for good reason, because it's really hard to say that that is an objective way to determine the success of students. A lot of the top institutions in the United States have also moved to test optional admissions, some in response to COVID and the accessibility of these tests, some for the foreseeable future. And it hasn't had an effect on the quality of education that these institutions are giving students or the competitiveness of their application. It's actually allowed them to see a wider pool of applicants and create a more well-rounded still very high achieving incoming class of students. So I'm wary of kind of turning to standardized tests, especially when we know that curriculum, even though it is a standardized curriculum, is delivered, even slight differences in the way that students are learning their math curriculum can affect their performance on a standardized test. So I'm not sure if that's the way we need to go. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I do think that we really need to change the way we think about grades and how we place value on the learning that a student has done.
All right, with that, I have about 1 minute left, and I do want to get Kelly and Paul in on that last minute. We talked about solutions. Do we have any solutions in terms of how do we get around this issue of grade inflation? I'll go to Kelly, and then Paul gets the last word.
Agree with
Yes.
Aisha. The U.S. is moving away from the SAT, partially because of the long-term impact of its discriminatory effect and the sort of test prep industry. I don't think standardized tests are the end of the world, but I think low stakes, common, normed, we should be able to compare. And there should be regular touch points, but it shouldn't necessarily be, the main goal of an education system to get test scores up. That's crazy.
All right, Paul, you get the last word on this.
Well, while I'm in favor of some kind of testing, I'm not thinking of testing in the sense of SATs, because it's been shown that they have very little relationship between scores on those tests and academic performance in post-secondary institutions. I'm thinking of the kind of test where people would be trained to read things critically. In other words, you would have, rather than multiple choice, you would have essay-type responses. And let's suppose it's in history. One of the questions might be whereby they analyze something historical. And there's no particular right or wrong answer, but the reader would be looking for the structure of the argument. And that would cover a lot of bases. It would cover the base of, do they know their history? Do they have analytical skills? And so on and so on. That's the kind of test that I think that we need. And that's one way to get into this whole problem. The last thing I want to mention is that we have 62% of our youth between the ages of 18 and 24 connected with post-secondary education. The figure for Germany, the powerhouse of Europe, is 30%. That's because they have institutions that recognize that people have different aptitudes, and you don't have to go to university to realize your potential. And we unfortunately denigrate some of the skills that people might acquire in those situations. We think everybody has to go to university, and that's wrong.
All right, we are going to leave it there. Paul, Serge, Kelly, Aisha, thank you so much. Really great conversation. Really appreciate you joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the depths of the Depression nearly 100 years ago, a remarkable thing happened in Chatham, Ontario. A baseball team comprised solely of black players won the provincial championship. In the process, more than a decade before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, they did what might have once seemed impossible. Heidi L.M. Jacobs documents that story in her new book. It's called 1934, The Chatham Colored All-Stars Barrier-Breaking Year. And she is with us here in the studio. And we are also joined on the line from Chatham, Ontario by Deirdre McCorkindale. She's a board member of the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society and an assistant professor of history at the University of Guelph. And she worked on the 1934 research project as a student. And we are delighted to have you two here on our program tonight. Heidi, Deirdre, great to have you here. Heidi, start us off. How did you discover it in the first place?
Well, I always say this story sort of fell into my lap. A colleague of mine at the University of Windsor in the history department called me and said, I met this lady at an event in Chatham, and she was wondering if we could help her make a website about her father-in-law, who was a baseball player and a hockey player and part of this black baseball team that I had never heard of. So I instantly wrote back and said, absolutely. And at the time, we thought we would finish this up in 3 or 4 months, but it's been 7 or 8 years right now. So this story really kind of fell in my lap. And the minute I saw these scrapbooks that Pat Harding had, I was just hooked.
And we should establish that you're a big baseball person, right? We had you on the program a couple of years ago because you and your husband went to some ridiculous number of ballparks in some ridiculous number of consecutive days.
50 baseball games in one summer in a 100-mile radius. So,
there we go. That was it. That was it. Now, why was 1934 such an important year for all of this?
Well, 1934 was an interesting year. It was in the middle of the Depression, and the All-Stars had a number of players who were on the team from the neighborhood of the East End of Chatham. So the players always say we had a lot of spare time because there wasn't a lot of work to be had. So the team had a big momentum, I think partially because of the economic climate, but also because the team played in the center of the community in the East End of Chatham at a place called Sterling Park, which was a social and cultural center of the community, and all the neighborhood would come out in the evenings to watch the team. But
and Sterling Park was named after?
Archie Sterling, who was a local businessman in the neighborhood, and
white guy.
A white man, yep. And he was a future mayor of Chatham, too.
There we go. Well, let's talk Chatham. Deirdre, maybe you can help us with some of the demographics of Chatham, the population, the black population of Chatham, nearly 100 years ago from this time that we're talking about.
Okay, so that's a big question. So the very first black presence, because we should talk about this, Chatham's kind of known as being a terminus on the Underground Railroad, and I promise I will get to that point. But before it was a terminus on the Underground Railroad, the very first black person that we have recorded in Chatham was an enslaved man. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you much about him besides his name, Frank, but I always like to start the story of Chatham with him because the story of Chatham's black community is a story of activism, but that shadow of slavery is still very much so a part of it. So Black folks start really moving into the Kent County area. So we're talking about, for the major cities, we're talking about Chatham, Dresden, North Buxton, and then all of the kind of rural areas in between. They start coming in after the passage of the Act to Limit Slavery in Upper Canada, and they especially start coming in the 1830s. But when we see the biggest numbers of Black folks coming into Chatham is in the 1850s, when the United States passes the Fugitive Slave Act, because with the passage of that act, it made for enslaved people living in America who may have fled to places like Ohio or New York, it made living there much, much more dangerous. So we see a bigger exodus. So that's when the population starts to really grow in Chatham. And by the mid 1850s, 1/3 of Chatham's population was Black. And while many Black folks would leave the Chatham area after when the Civil War starts, because they went to go fight in the Civil War and to also help with the Reconstruction efforts down south. Many people stayed, and also many people also just came across the border. We have in Chatham very important connections with people in Windsor, but also people in the Michigan region, and people go back and forth across the border all the time. And that's actually reflected in some of the things that Heidi talks about in the book. And so it maintained that population well into the 30s. We kind of freeze the Black population in Chatham at that 1850s marker of the Underground Railroad, but that community stayed pretty vibrant for quite some time. Well,
let's talk about some of the Black ball players who were, fantastic athletes at the time, and of course prohibited, not by law, but by bad custom from playing in Major League Baseball at the time. This is Boomer Harding, and he's a member of the All-Stars, and there he is. Heidi, go ahead, describe him if you would, and tell us a bit about him.
Well, Boomer Harding is, to me, he's sort of the key to this project because it was through Boomer's daughter-in-law, Pat, who created the scrapbooks documenting his life. So he was one of the youngest players, if not, I think the youngest player on the team, and a couple of his brothers also played on the team as well. But Boomer went on to be a hockey player. He was on the farm team for the Detroit Red Wings. He was a track and field athlete in high school. He played any sport that would have him. He played sports for his whole life up until horseshoes in his later years. So he was a really powerful athlete and a real competitor. He was also the first Black man to be a postman in Chatham as well. So he broke a lot of barriers in a number of ways.
And how did the whole All-Stars team come together in the first place as well?
Well, they were a neighborhood team. The All-Stars, I think a lot of times people think the All-Stars came out of nowhere, but there were black baseball teams as early possibly as the 1880s and 1890s. But a number of the coaches on the All-Stars played for a team called the Chatham Giants in the 1920s, and there was record of black baseball in the region that goes back to 1905 as well. So they didn't come out of nowhere. There was a strong tradition. So the players were playing, as I mentioned, the East End was a really vibrant community place, and they were coming together. And then Archie Sterling saw these amazing guys playing mostly sort of pickup games and got them into the league.
Okay, Deirdre, how important was baseball to the region at this time?
For Chatham, I can't stress how important baseball was. I mean, sports in general was, because it was a way for the community to come together and have fun. Baseball, very famously, is kind of a sport that you don't typically need a lot of money for. And it was a way that everybody could spend time together and have fun with each other. And it was also a way for them to kind of showcase their athletic abilities as well. So those games, the professional games, are really important because they kind of are able to show people outside of the community the vibrancy of the community when they go to like away games and things like that. But even within the community, it's a kind of tremendous support network that gets formed around these baseball players and these games, and other people start forming their own teams and things like that. So it's just really, really important for the community and community building itself.
And let me do a little follow-up, a little personal follow-up with you if I can, because you're obviously way too young to have remembered any of this, but your grandmother... Your grandmother was born a few years after the All-Stars were in their prime, and I gather they did have an effect on her generation. Talk about that, if you would.
They did. She always talked about them and how important the team was. But I think an important thing to talk about is it's not the way that she talks about them. It's not so much just that they played ball. It's that they were leaders of their community, that they were an example in the community that, people could strive towards. And that was something that's taken away. She's never really talked to me much about, who won and who didn't win at those particular times, but she talks to me about how important those people were and how much they were there for each other. And when you're dealing with things, and, she grew up in the 40s, when you're a young kid dealing with institutional racism yourself, to have people like the All-Stars there as your role models, it's really important. So that's kind of what they meant for the community. I mean, it's amazing that they won too, obviously. It's always great to win, but their importance goes beyond just that win. It was what they were doing that was important to people, and who they were when they came back was also important.
For sure. Let's take, Heidi, let's look at a couple of more pictures. That's a shot of King Terrell. Is that how he says his name?
Turrell.
Turrell, okay.
Turrell, like turtle.
Turtle like turtle, right. Yeah, you mentioned that in the book, actually. And Flat Chase. Who are these two guys?
These two men, I think, are real embodiments of what was great about this team. Flat Chase was a formidable hitter and a fantastic pitcher, which is a rare combination. And he was just a charismatic guy. I compiled the stats for the 1934 season, and he was batting about 470, which is pretty good.
That's pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. So, he was a legend. He was sort of larger than life in terms of stuff. There's a story there. Everyone says he's got the record for the longest home run ball in every park he's hit in. There's a line that says they're still looking for balls that he hit. So he was that kind of hero that people have.
How do you get a nickname like Flat?
Apparently it's the way he ran. Apparently something about his feet or something. So, okay. But it stuck. So he's Flat Chase. But King Turrell was, to me, also he was a very, very solid player. He was a left-handed third baseman.
That's very rare.
It is very rare. So he was legendary in that way. But he was also really interesting to me working on this project because he was also a very reflective storyteller. There was a couple of key interviews that he gave about what it was like to be on this team. And he also really helped, as Dorothy, Deirdre's grandmother, has said, he also helped to mentor the next generations in sports and in life. So he was a real crucial person.
Let's do another picture here as well. Now, one of the names in this next picture is going to be familiar, although this isn't the guy, but this is the guy's dad, Ferguson Jenkins Sr. That's him on the left, Andy Harding, and Ross Talbot. Okay, Heidi, tell us about these three guys.
Well, I think people know who Fergie Jenkins' son.
I hope they know.
I hope they know, too.
I hope they know. Fergie, the first ever Canadian inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yes.
And a phenomenal pitcher back in the day.
Yep, and a real champion for Chatham. So yeah, he's legendary, but he's also a strong member of this team and played throughout them. Andy Harding was one of the Harding brothers as well. And Ross Talbot was an interesting man too. He was a businessman and a ball player and just one of the, I think one of the solid players who contributed to the team overall.
Ferguson Jr. obviously got his talent from Fergie Sr.
It sure seems that way, doesn't it?
Sure does, yep. Says something about nature versus nurture.
Yep.
Okay, Deirdre, they were called the Chatham Colored All-Stars. Tell us why you think they were marketed in those kinds of racialized terms.
Well, I can't say for sure, but that was the era. And the naming conventions is something I try to explain to my students on a regular basis, that you need to understand when you're studying the history of Afro-Americans and Afro-Canadians, that the naming conventions change quite a bit. And colored was a terminology that was used quite often in the 30s. In fact, depending on which circle you'd look at, up until about the 1960s or 70s, to call somebody black would have been insulting to some black folks. It's really with kind of the rise of black power and a lot of those kind of conventions that we see those kind of tides changing. But colored seems very kind of dated, antiquated, and also insulting, almost like a slur to maybe us now. But at the time, that was a term that was used. And I think that it works because they were embracing their heritage. Because as kind of Heidi points out, that a lot of times in some of the newspaper coverage, race isn't always mentioned, but it's always present. And I think, in a sense, there's a proudness of being black and being from Chatham, but they just probably wouldn't have used the term black at the time. They would have used the right term for themselves. So I think that that is a kind of proud identifier for them,
Gotcha.
If that makes any sense.
Sure. Here's how Heidi describes it in the book. Baseball offered the men of color who played on the All-Stars the rare opportunity to exist on the same literal and metaphoric playing field as white men in a space where the rules were the same for both races. In many cases, baseball was an arena to best their white neighbors in front of their friends, family, and community in socially sanctioned ways. It provided occasion and opportunity to demand and gain respect both on and off the field. Okay, having said all that, I mean, that's wonderful, but having said all that, these guys undoubtedly faced racism in their day when they were playing baseball, on and off the field. What have you heard about how they dealt with all that?
That's a tricky thing to locate, and Deirdre and I have talked about this before. Sometimes they didn't share an awful lot of those details with their children, and so that record is a little scarce. But they did talk to each other, and in some of the interviews that we have, talk about what it's like to go to an out-of-town ballpark and beat the local team and get run out of town with garden implements chasing them.
No kidding.
Children using words we would not use today at the players and at the players' wives and girlfriends. So there was some very, very difficult things that the team endured. I think one of the things that Blake Harding, one of the Boomers' son, often says is the team gave as good as they got. So they did not stand for disrespect. And one of the things that the team really believed in was working toward gaining respect. And often, like Blake would say, the team would come into a town who had never seen a black baseball team or black people, and people would come out to see them as a bit of a novelty. But slowly, seeing the skill of these players, they would earn some respect on the field. And I think that respect started to seep over into the off-the-field world as well.
Well, give us a sense of how they played, because there's an expression in baseball, you play spikes up, meaning when you go slide into second base, your spikes are up so you can inflict damage on the second baseman or shortstop who's there waiting for the throw.
Yep.
Did they play that way?
They did. I think, and it's hard to piece together the record because obviously we don't have, footage of this, but it seems that they often got taken to task for being a bit too rough on the field, but there's enough evidence to suggest that one of the things that has happened is when they were being racially targeted or when things were not fair, they stood up for themselves. And so that the roughness often has some sort of precursor that we don't know about, but there's enough hints to suggest that they were reacting to something.
Sure. Deirdre, 1934 was a big year because the All-Stars won the championship that year. Did that earn them the respect that they wanted?
Yes and no. On the one hand, it did get the individual team, I guess, some recognition in the community, but right up until the 50s, when we had finally had the passing of the Fair Accommodations Act in Ontario, we still had segregation in Chatham and other parts of the county. And many Black folks also still had a hard time gaining employment. Heidi has I think, very important part of the book where, there was a, I believe it was a banquet that was provided for the All-Stars, and one of the players said, "Okay, so give us a chance now. We've won this game. Give us a chance." And in some ways, it did open doors for some people, and I'm not saying that it didn't, but one game doesn't fix several hundred years of institutional barriers. It would be wonderful if it did. So I guess, the answer is yes and no.
Right. Well, actually, let me follow up with you on that, Heidi, because it is a tradition in baseball that when your career is over as a player, many of them get jobs as managers or general managers or coaches or scouts or, all sorts of things. Did that happen for these guys?
A number of the players coached local teams, but it's certainly not any professional way. But they did, a number of them did have jobs that they probably wouldn't have had before. There's a great interview with Boomer Harding, a man of few words, but someone asked him, did things change after you won for players? And he said, yeah, pause. Slowly, it did. Some doors opened. But I think that pause in his interview, when you actually hear it, I think is really revealing about, yes, things did change, but very slowly, as Deirdre had just mentioned.
And what ultimately happened to this All-Star team?
Many of them stayed lifelong friends. Many of them continued to play on different teams. A few of them went off to the war. A few of them moved back to Detroit or other regions. But those who stayed in Chatham stayed involved in sport and played on different teams. And as the decades progressed and the years progressed, they became more integrated teams as well. So there were Black players on white teams, and Flat Chase played for the London Majors, and so they.
It's inter-county baseball.
Yep. So they did continue to play baseball.
Got it. We want to show one more picture here, and all the pictures we've been showing so far have been in black and white. This one's in color, and this is Sagasta Harding and Don Tabron. And Heidi, maybe you could tell us the significance of these two.
Well, those are the two longest living players, and they were at the Blue Jays. The Blue Jays honored the All-Stars at I think it must have been a Negro Leagues weekend, and so these two men were the last remaining players, so they were representing the team. And I think this is a really big turning point in the reputation of the team, and that sense of recognition of these two men. They have both since passed, but I think it was a very special moment for all of the families and descendants to see their team on this national scale.
Do you remember what year that was?
It was in the, no, 2001, was it?
2002, I'm told?
Okay, 2002, yep.
Okay, so more than 20 years ago.
Yep.
You just used an expression, and we may need to do a little explaining here.
Yep.
You said the Negro Leagues. Now, that's a word you wouldn't use today, but in fact, that's what they were called. It was called the Negro Leagues, which existed simultaneously to Major League Baseball, and there's a museum in Kansas City called the Negro League Museum.
Correct, yep.
So we'll just get that on the record.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that term actually, Deirdre, when you were talking about the use of the word colored, the Negro Leagues still sort of points to that particular history, and we still use that phrase in baseball history. Yep.
Deirdre, with this book that has come out and the inclusion of the All-Stars in the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame last year, are you now satisfied that the story of the Chatham colored All-Stars has been properly recognized?
Well, I don't think I'm ever going to be satisfied.
Now, why is that?
There's so much more to say, and there's so much more. You're asking a historian if the story has been fully told, so the answer is always going to be no. You know, what I love about, I think Heidi's done an excellent job with this book. What I love about her book is a really important part that she includes at her conclusion and her final chapter, where she talks about the importance of not just focusing on 1934. This team isn't just important because they won. They're important to the community. She has spent time talking about the families, but also there's a whole other story about what happened after and the community that existed after. So I think this is a good amount of the story that we've told, but there's always more.
That's a great way to put it. 1934, the Chatham Colored All-Stars barrier-breaking year, and we are delighted that it has brought Heidi L.M. Jacobs to our studio and Deirdre McCorkindale on the line from Chatham, Ontario. Thanks, you two.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
The 6.9 million Canadians that are living in food insecure situations right now, that's not a number of people using food banks. That's a very rigorous measurement of a very significant problem of food access that is done by Statistics Canada.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.